Right, okay, obviously another thing about Valorant is, this is one part that might be confusing if you're a more general esports fan, but because it's a game that has only ever existed during the pandemic/online period, we've never had what every other game had, like a full open circuit where, all the regions play so much. So as a result, if people don't know, those VCT tournaments are enormous just because you finally get to see the regions meet, and then you get the whole, rivalries of who's better. At the moment, obviously, it's like EU or NA, etc. drama, but there's obviously even the element that, like, Korea's looked more and more promising as the years have gone on. This is my question for you at the beginning. I realise this in itself is always an open-ended but dodgy question, right? At the moment, is NA actually better than EU? That's like essentially the results have implied it, right?
The results.
There's a debate, at least.
Right, yeah, so big debate. The results at the start of 2021 definitely implied it. Like, if you look at the first half of 2021, I think that if you were to try and argue that EU is better than NA, you would be rightfully laughed out the room, not because EU was bad, but because NA was just showing such dominance. However, and this is actually the really interesting part of like the life of an esport that I'm quite excited to be present for, because I was slightly too late to the party with Overwatch to be there for this. And that is that period in which being mechanically good isn't good enough anymore, because teams are understanding the game better. And I feel like we started to see that come into play as we headed into the second half of 2021, and that's where EU started to overtake NA. And one of the big things, and I think we'll maybe touch on this a little bit later, is Sentinels. They are sort of the spearhead of that story for NA, because they won Masters 2, which was the big LAN that was held in Reykjavik in May, and didn't drop a map. It was like total domination. They get to Masters 3, and they went out in quarters, if I remember correctly. I mean, I was at the fucking event, I should remember, but they had a tough time. And at the time, people were like, well, what the fuck is this? Like, this is not what we were expecting. Get to champs. Suddenly they've hired a coach, because the whole thing was Shazam, the IGL, he was essentially playing as coach. They hired a head coach, Raucus, who used to be in the Overwatch League, played for Houston Outlaws. He played for FaZe Clan in Valorant. And still those problems were persisting. And now they've just had, like, last weekend had a really fucking weird weekend in terms of, like, how their play was. After their first map, which was, like, utter shit, in, like, to be perfectly honest, it was a 13-2 on their map pick. It's announced on Twitter that Raucus isn't their head coach anymore, like blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so there's all this like random shit that's going on with Sentinels, but they are sort of that real, the figurehead for what is happening with NA. And actually, when we look at the teams in NA that seem to be really thriving at the moment, they are the teams that have very good utility usage. So the Guard, who are just like have come out of nowhere and been amazing. C9 and Optic, who were Envy and are obviously now called Optic after the merger, Envy did really well at Masters 3. They came second, and then had a bit of a rough champs, and then they've come into stage 1 of 2022, and suddenly it looks like their utility usage and their coordination as a team is really good. And so I think that's very descriptive of like where those problems were with NA, because NA were by far and away just like this insanely mechanically skilled, super dominant region. And as EU started to sort of overtake with the understanding of the game, we've had this sort of dip, and now those NA teams are starting to come back.
That was the question I had, because the other thing was as well, some of this I'm obviously also going off when I've read like Reddit threads and stuff. I also noticed, like, as you said, this is the reason why the idea of the whole NA region was better didn't really sit, is because when I looked at it, even back then in the results, it was like, as you say, they had one really good team. Obviously, like, Sentinels was considered the best team in all of Valorant. So by default, it made the region look strong. But whenever I talked to the EU pros, they all told me it's more like EU's like deeper though. Like you could sort of go like 5 to 10 teams deep in EU, whereas in NA it was like they were top heavy in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, the EU pros would say that, right? But no,
I mean understandable bias, yeah, of course.
I think that's fair. I mean, again, like that was just before I kind of got into Valorant. So this was the tail end of the last things that sort of happened before I really dove in. Okay. So I actually got in at the time where that turning point started to happen. And don't get me wrong, I remember being kind of disappointed with the performance of a number of EU teams during that period when I started casting Valorant.
Sure.
You know, big example for me was Team Liquid. I thought that Team Liquid was...
They didn't even qualify for one of the VCTs, if people don't know, yeah.
Right. So Team Liquid was probably when I first started sort of watching Valorant and kind of getting into it at the end of stage 2, just before Masters 2, which is the one that Sentinels won, I was like, oh yeah, this Team Liquid team, like they look pretty sick.
They were very hyped, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously people are just like on their knees for Scream. Like people love Scream in the same way that people love Tens. Like he's just one of those players that people adore. But then in stage 2, they started stage 3, they started making some changes with how they were playing that I didn't fully agree with. And, you know, a lot of people at the time would say things like, yeah, well, the thing with Sliggy is like, when he gets it wrong, he can be really off, but if he gets it right, he really gets it right. And I was like, okay, well, you know, like, I'm not going to judge someone's coaching like 2 weeks into me watching a fucking team. But, I think that some of the decisions that they were making in stage 3, the big one for me was moving Scream onto... This was when KO stopped being quarantined, so he could finally be played in the in like competitive play. And I remember a lot of people when KO was first announced said like, oh, this is really going to resonate with like the CS players. But I think a lot of teams were playing KO wrong at the time, as is very common in any hero shooter. When a new character comes in, teams will think they know how to play, and then it turns out as the meta settles that a different play style is better. And Team Liquid just fell to that. I think they were trying to play Scream as a duelist KO, whereas these days KO can be played very effectively, but not in that kind of play style. Fnatic was another one who, obviously, they were in the finals for Masters 2 against Sentinels. Massively popular team, like Boaster being just such a big personality on the team absolutely has helped with that. But they had a bit of a rough stage 3 as well. So I'm not trying to say by any means that EU came into stage 3 and were just suddenly perfect. But when we had the rise of teams like Gambit, you know, the Russian team that ended up winning Masters 3, and Ascend, who actually became the first world champions in December, you know, it was watching those teams grow and how they were growing and what it was that was making them good. You know, the most spoken about player on Gambit wasn't their duelist, it was their Sentinel, because he was so good at lurking and he had a really unique way of doing it. And that was the kind of thing that was being spoken about in EU and the thing that was being praised in EU. Whereas at the time, people were still trying to figure out, like, why was it that NA weren't having that, you know, like really stand out thing anymore, because the most spoken about person on Sentinels was Tens, because Tens click head good. And don't get me wrong, Tens is a great player. I gave him a lot of shit on the desk at Masters 3 because Sentinels weren't performing to expectations, but he is by far and away an amazing player, and I think Shazam still seems to be one of the best IGLs in the game. But that's just the difference in what was being highlighted in those regions as that, you know, as those things kind of unfolded.
Okay, let's stay on the NA topic a little bit and then we'll do some of the EU ones later. So let's talk a bit about Sentinels then. This is the question I have. You kind of characterized it well there, like essentially the period when they were on top was when the game was about like mechanics. And if you look at their team, if you know the players they have, obviously once upon a time they had Sinatra, who was considered like a prodigy in Overwatch and was a massive name. Yeah. Now they have Tens, who obviously in Counter-Strike was actually considered like an up-and-comer. People thought he was going to be very good. Even some of the other names they have, like Six, a guy who did play many years in Counter-Strike, but he was considered to have like skill. That was one of his strengths. He just maybe didn't make it as a complete player at tier 1. And then Dapper, actually, people don't know, the last year, the year that came online basically, was actually the year where I think if he hadn't have gone to Valorant, he actually might have snuck through and he might now be in some of the better NA Counter-Strike teams. So he was a guy who had skill as well. So actually when I look at their team, it is a pretty skill, like in terms of raw mechanics, it should always be a skill stack team. The question would be this then, do you actually think that Sentinels and or some of the other top NA teams, do they still play to like, because I would say personally in most games I've followed, actually it's an American approach that you tend to be almost like a little bit individualistic. You try to play around like your skill, and typically you don't tend to play, these are all very broad strokes of course, you don't tend to play as disciplined or go more towards the tactical edge. Does Sentinels fit that sort of characterization now? Are they actually a team that's going more towards like a team play approach that you're talking about?
No, and that's the problem. So the thing with Sentinels is like, imagine you've been handed a jar of diamonds and you've been tasked with embellishing the most beautiful like ball gown for the Met Gala, as I'm sure you do a lot in your spare time.
I've never had these hypotheticals before, believe it or not, but keep going. Yeah, I'll imagine it. Okay, I'm in.
Okay, so you start taking the diamonds out and you're placing them in random fucking places on the dress. You got like one on this nipple, one on this shoulder, whatever, and it looks like garbage. But the person next to you who's also been tasked with the same thing has like placed them beautifully. It's the same diamonds. They're still like the most incredible, beautiful things that you can put on something. But how you structure them will ultimately decide whether the final product is good.
Yes.
And this is the issue that I personally have with Sentinels right now is the players on this team, I don't look at them and say, nah, they're washed. There's a problem with them. I don't think that at all. But I think the problem with Sentinels is that they are lacking the structure that other teams have. Now, one of their big problems is that they don't have a head coach. And it's not like... It's entirely possible to play without one. I mean, a good example that we had in Rainbow Six was BDS, who are arguably the best team in Europe, who have also gone a very long time in their domination without a head coach. It can be done, but I think a lot of people started to speculate that it was too much for Shazam. Like, you know, he's clearly a very skilled dude, but the problem is Sentinel's playstyle is very fluid and it's entirely intuitive. It's really just based on adaptation, making those decisions like as the game plays out. And I think that the way other teams are playing now does not lend itself to that working very well anymore. You can't just make a site rush or like start pushing really heavily with minimal utility and expect to be able to go through a really, robust defense that another team may have. And it means they end up running out of time. It means they end up getting killed off when, if you were to look at the direct mechanical skill diff, you might still hand that over to Sentinels, but you still have to be setting them up in a way that's conducive to them winning those duels, right? And this is why a lot of people had hope for them when they announced Raucus coming in. I don't really know what to expect of Raucus as a coach because I've only ever really known him as a player. But whatever, they trusted him, they brought him in, but they were still really playing in a way that was not based around set plays, but it was still based around like really adaptive stuff. Now, if that's the play style you really want to go for, and that's what your heart is set on, go for it, but I personally don't think that that's the right decision for Sentinels. I think they need to bring someone in who can come and bring more structure and say here is like, what we're going to be, we're going to specifically like scrim this set play and we're going to like do this one over and over, and we're actually going to start to bring more structure into how we're doing that. We can let Shazam focus on IGLing and not sort of sharing himself between these different things. And I think, in my opinion, that would allow a lot of their skill to flourish way better than it currently is. Because I don't personally believe that this is a team of bad players or players who are past their prime.
Yes. I will say, didn't expect some sort of a bedazzled slight analogy, but fair enough. Well, we're working with a different mindset here, boys. There you go. It was pretty good.
You don't get that from Monty or Richard.
Listen, I got what you meant by that. I just obviously couldn't relate to being in that scenario and going, I fucked up this stress. But I understand the premise, right? The reason I also think you make a shrewd point there is because, again, if the funny thing is, people will think you're like dissing the team, like you say, but in a way, what you're doing is complimenting them, because what you're saying is if someone could actually essentially like get these star players all on the same page and make that skill work for you, then potentially you could be the best team, couldn't you? So
well, like,
the potential's there.
There were definitely people on social media who were incensed around the time of Masters 3 that I was giving shit to Sentinels. But my response is always, the reason I'm giving them shit is because I know they can do better. Like, I'm not going to give that much shit to a team who aren't playing like super great, but I don't personally think they can play better, right? There would be no point. The reason that I was giving Sentinels shit is because I'm like, we know what this team can achieve. Like, we've seen it before. Why aren't we seeing that now? That's why I'm giving them shit. And so, yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I'm just like, this should be one of the best teams in NA. And as it stands, where they are in their group in VCT, like they are still currently on a trajectory for making it into playoffs, but I don't personally think that right now they're in a position to make it to the finals of playoffs and qualify for Masters.
Right, so in theory, they need to change something big then. Yeah. Okay. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.